The crystalline spires of Neo Olympus pierced the amber haze of morning smog, their surfaces catching fractured beams of sunlight as they fought through Earth's still-recovering atmosphere. Darren Hayes sipped his coffee, leaning against the window of his modest apartment, watching hover cars zip between the towers. Just another uneventful morning in the year 2157, or so he thought. The knock on his door was so soft he almost didn't hear it. When he opened it, Darren froze. Standing before him was what appeared to be a hologram, a tall, translucent figure with shimmering platinum skin and eyes like twin galaxies. Darren Hayes, the figure said in a voice that resonated like a cathedral organ. "I am Ambassador Vorin of the Celestial Council. May I come in?" Darren's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. In the 5 years since Earth had joined the Celestial Council, he'd never met an alien in person, let alone one standing in his doorway. "Sure," he stammered, stepping aside. "Sorry about the mess." Ambassador Vorin glided into the apartment with the grace of a monarch, somehow making the dingy space, cluttered with half-eaten takeout and yesterday's laundry, feel insignificant. "I bring news of great importance," Vorin began, "concerning your grandfather, Elias Hayes." Darren frowned. "My grandfather? He disappeared 2 decades ago on some space expedition. Everyone figured he was dead." "Not dead," Vorin corrected. "At least, not until recently." From his shimmering robes, he produced a crystalline sphere that projected a glowing holographic document. "Your grandfather was a close confidant and advisor to King Azarek of Lyrian, a powerful monarchy in the outer systems." Darren's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, Lyrian? As in the same people who call Earth a cosmic accident?" "The very same," Vorin confirmed, his tone unreadable. "And now, due to your grandfather's influence, you have inherited a unique and delicate responsibility within their royal court." "What responsibility?" Darren asked, already dreading the answer. Vorin straightened, his holographic projection flickering slightly. "Guardian and future consort to the 4 princesses of Lyrian." Darren stared at him, the words not computing. Then he burst out laughing. "All right, who put you up to this? Was it Terry from work? This is elaborate. Even for him. This is no joke, Mr. Hayes." Vorin's voice sharpened. "King Azarek is dead. His will explicitly names you as the guardian of his daughters and their intended consort. The stability of Earth's position in the Celestial Council may depend on your acceptance of this role." Darren's laughter faded. "You're kidding. I assure you," Vorin said coolly, "I am not." He held out a small, metallic disc, its surface glowing faintly. "You have 1 hour to pack your belongings. We depart for Lyrian immediately. Choose wisely what you bring, for you may not return to Earth for a long time." Darren hesitated, staring at the disc. "And if I say no?" "Then Earth risks losing its most powerful ally in the galaxy, and the princess's rivals will exploit your refusal as proof that humanity is unworthy of galactic respect." Vorin turned toward the door. "1 hour, Mr. Hayes. I suggest you use it wisely." As the ambassador's hologram disappeared, Darren looked down at the glowing disc in his hand. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat. He sighed. "Well," he muttered, "at least it's not another boring Tuesday." The journey to Lyrian passed in a blur of hyperspace jumps and hurried cultural briefings. Darren spent most of the time flipping through documents Vorin had provided, though his thoughts kept wandering to the looming reality. For alien princesses, an arranged marriage, and Earth's future on the line. No pressure. When their ship finally emerged from the final hyperspace jump, Darren's breath caught. The planet of Lyrian hung before them like a glittering sapphire, its surface a mix of amethyst oceans and glowing crystalline landmasses. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Vorin said, appearing beside him. Darren nodded. "Yeah, beautiful and completely terrifying." The ship descended through layers of iridescent clouds, heading toward the capital city. Towers of living crystal stretched into the sky, connected by shimmering bridges of light. Giant, winged creatures, somewhere between whales and butterflies, floated gracefully between the spires. At the city's heart rose the royal palace, a structure that looked like a frozen fountain, refracting the light of Lyrian's 3 suns into cascading rainbows. As they landed, Darren felt his stomach tighten. "Remember," Vorin said as they disembarked, "bow deeply when introduced, maintain eye contact without staring, and, above all, do not comment on their genetically enhanced appearance." "They're what?" The Lyrianese consider themselves the pinnacle of humanoid evolution. Any implication otherwise will be taken as an insult. Darren barely had time to process that before they were escorted through corridors of glowing crystal. Guards in reflective armor that looked like liquid metal eyed him with thinly veiled disdain. At last, they entered a grand chamber open to the violet skies. "The princesses of Lyrian," announced a disembodied voice. For figures stood on a raised dais. Darren's first thought was that the briefing documents hadn't done them justice. Each was tall, graceful, and otherworldly, with features so perfect they seemed carved from light itself. Their eyes glimmered with an intelligence that felt almost predatory. The eldest, Princess Kalara, stepped forward. Her silver-white hair floated gently around her, despite the still air. "This," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "is the human our father chose?" Darren swallowed, bowing as deeply as he could. "Your Highnesses," he began, "I assure you, I'm just as surprised by this arrangement as you are." "Surprised," said Princess Marin, the second eldest, her copper-red hair catching the light like molten gold. "What a quaint emotion. Tell me, human, do all of your species dress in such crude fabrics? Or is this your best attempt at formalities?" Darren glanced down at his suit, suddenly feeling underdressed. Before he could respond, the third princess, Valira, circled him like a hunting cat. Her platinum hair framed her face like a halo. "I'm more interested in how this creature convinced our father of his worth. Tell me, Earthling, did your grandfather teach you some extraordinary tricks?" Before Darren could reply, the youngest princess, Silvara, laughed, her voice melodic yet laced with venom. "Look at him. He's barely capable of forming coherent sentences. This must have been Father's final joke, leaving us in the care of a bumbling ape." Darren straightened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You know," he said sharply, "if we're going to talk about evolution, maybe clinging to outdated prejudices isn't the best look for a supposedly advanced species." The chamber went silent. Even the guards seemed to stop breathing. Kalara's silver eyes narrowed. "You dare speak to us this way?" "Yeah, I dare," Darren shot back, holding her gaze. "Your father chose me for a reason. Maybe, instead of jumping to conclusions, you should consider that he might have had a good one." Valira's lips curved into a sly smile. Bold words for someone who may not survive the trials. "Trials?" Darren repeated, alarmed. Kalara inclined her head. "3 trials to prove your worth. The first begins at dawn." "Great," Darren muttered, looking forward to it. As he was escorted from the chamber, Darren caught a flicker of curiosity in Silvara's expression, though she quickly masked it with disdain. Whatever game the late king had been playing, Darren was beginning to suspect it was more complicated than anyone realized. In his quarters, a luxurious suite that put Earth's finest hotels to shame, Darren stared out at the crystalline city below. The 3 suns of Lyrian were setting, painting the skies in hues of gold and violet. "Well, Grandpa," he murmured, "you've really left me in the deep end this time." A soft chime interrupted his thoughts. A holographic message appeared before him. "First trial, the challenge of mind. Dawn, Great Hall, come unarmed." Darren smiled grimly. "Yeah, because that doesn't sound like a trap at all." Chapter 2, The Challenge of Mind. The next morning, Darren woke to the soft chime of his holographic communicator, signaling the start of the first trial. He had barely slept. His mind raced with uncertainty and the bizarre new reality he was facing. 4 alien princesses, an ancient kingdom, and a royal responsibility he had no idea how to manage. But none of that mattered now. He had a trial to survive. Darren stepped into the lavish bath chamber, unsure where to begin. The crystal walls shimmered with an ethereal glow, casting a soft light across the room. The shower itself was more like an intricate network of floating water droplets suspended in midair, each one seemingly controlled by invisible forces. He didn't have time to figure out the mechanics of it. He dressed quickly in the simple clothes provided to him by the royal staff, dark tunic and pants that somehow made him feel even more out of place in this alien world. The hour passed quickly, and he was escorted by 2 guards through the labyrinthine halls of the palace to the Great Hall. The floating platforms, translucent walkways, and walls of shimmering crystal made the place feel like a living, breathing structure, always shifting, always changing. As he entered the Great Hall, he was struck by the vastness of the space. The ceilings were so high that they seemed to merge with the violet sky above. The floor was a polished obsidian that reflected every step, and in the center of the hall stood a massive archway framed by glowing, pulsating runes. It was an imposing sight, but it was also beautiful, almost hypnotic. A single figure stood in the center of the room. "Mr. Hayes," a voice boomed, seemingly from the very walls of the chamber. "You are late." Darren's breath hitched as the figure turned. It was Vorin, the celestial ambassador, his holographic form flickering with a strange intensity. Sorry," Darren muttered. "This place is a maze." Vorin's voice held a tinge of something that could have been amusement, or maybe it was just an alien's attempt at sarcasm. "Do not concern yourself with my timing. Focus on the task at hand. You have come to prove your worth to the princesses of Lyrian, and to the kingdom itself." Darren looked around nervously. The room was empty except for Vorin and the massive archway. "So, what's the deal with the trial? I'm assuming it's not just a test of my ability to stand here without getting distracted by the shiny walls." The ambassador's silver eyes narrowed, though his expression remained neutral. "The first trial is a test of the mind, your ability to reason, to think strategically under pressure. The Lyrianese value intelligence above all. If you fail, you will be deemed unworthy to take the next step in your role." Darren swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but it definitely wasn't this. "Okay, I guess I'm ready." Vorin raised a hand, and the air around Darren shimmered. The space before him twisted, bending like liquid glass. Then, the archway pulsed with light, and the room around him seemed to dissolve entirely. Suddenly, Darren found himself standing in a dark, infinite expanse. He could hear his heartbeat in the silence, each thump echoing like a drum. There were no walls, no floors, only an overwhelming emptiness. It felt as if the very concept of reality was slipping away. And then, a voice broke through the void. "Welcome to the trial of mind." It was the voice of a woman, sweet but firm, and it seemed to surround him from every direction. "You will face 3 questions. Your answers will determine your success. Fail, and you will remain here forever, trapped in the depths of your own mind. Do not hesitate. Choose wisely." The voice faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Darren felt his pulse quicken. The air seemed thicker here, as if the very atmosphere was pressing against his chest. Then a question appeared in the space before him, floating in luminous letters. "What is the most important thing in the universe?" Darren blinked, staring at the words. His first instinct was to scoff at the simplicity of the question. What was the most important thing in the universe? There were so many possible answers. Power? Knowledge? Family? But something about the question nagged at him, as though it was trickier than it seemed. Darren paced in a tight circle, trying to make sense of it. Every option felt like a possible answer, but none seemed like the right one. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Maybe it wasn't about finding the right answer at all. Maybe it was about understanding what the question truly meant. What was important to him? What was important to humanity? "Hope," he said out loud, surprising himself. "The most important thing in the universe is hope." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then the voice returned. "Correct." The space shifted, and a new question appeared. "What is the greatest weapon?" Darren's heart raced. This time, the question felt darker, more dangerous. He thought of everything he'd seen in his life. Wars, weapons, destruction. It was clear this wasn't just about physical power. It had to be something deeper. "The mind," he said, his voice growing more certain. "The greatest weapon is the mind. It's the only thing that can change the world for better or worse." The air around him rippled again, and the voice spoke once more. "Correct." Darren's stomach twisted. There was still one question left, and the sense of unease gnawed at him. The next question was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Finally, the final question appeared. What is your greatest fear? Darren froze. This one felt personal, too personal. He didn't want to answer it. But in the silence, the question seemed to grow, pressing against him, waiting for an answer. He thought about it for a long moment. He thought about the fear of failure, of losing control, of being a pawn in a game he didn't understand. But there was something deeper than that, something he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. My greatest fear, Darren's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the emptiness. My greatest fear is not living up to the legacy of those who came before me. There was a long pause. Then, the voice responded. Correct. The void around Darren shifted again, dissolving like mist. He found himself standing back in the great hall, the archway still glowing in front of him. His legs felt weak, his head spinning from the strange trial. Vorin stood nearby, his holographic form flickering with a quiet intensity. You have passed the trial of mind, Vorin said, his voice somehow softer. You may proceed. Darren wiped his forehead, his hands shaking slightly. Well, that was something. You are not finished yet, Mr. Hayes, Vorin reminded him. There are still 2 trials remaining, but the princesses will be watching closely now. The real test has only just begun. Darren nodded, swallowing hard. He had passed the first trial, but the next steps would be even more dangerous. Whatever game the king had set in motion, Darren was only beginning to understand how high the stakes really were. And the princesses of Lyrian? They were not going to make it easy. Chapter 3. The Trial of Will. The second trial came faster than Darren expected, though it hardly seemed like a proper trial at first. After all, he wasn't required to solve riddles or fight strange alien creatures. Instead, he found himself standing in a simple, open courtyard surrounded by walls of smooth, glowing crystal. He'd been escorted here by a team of silent guards, all wearing helmets that reflected the shimmering sunlight of the 3 suns hanging low in the purple sky. The air smelled faintly of something floral, a scent that seemed strangely comforting. As Darren looked around, he saw no one. Just the courtyard, with its marble flooring and a large crystal archway that led into an even grander structure beyond. His heart skipped a beat. This was a royal trial, right? He had no idea what to expect. The stillness in the air was unsettling. Every step he took felt like it echoed across the vast space, despite the silence. Finally, a figure appeared in the distance, one that made Darren's pulse quicken. It was the 3rd princess, Xanthia, her platinum blonde hair trailing behind her like a radiant comet, her eyes sharp and calculating. She approached him with the same predatory grace he had noticed before, moving with a fluid elegance that made her seem both untouchable and dangerous. Mr. Hayes, she said coolly as she stopped a few feet from him. Her tone was colder than he remembered, her posture perfect, like an elegant predator. The second trial is simple. Prove you are capable of controlling your own mind and emotions. You will face me, and you must try to break my will. Darren raised an eyebrow. Wait, you want me to break your will? Xanthia's lips twitched upward, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Indeed. But be warned, Earthling. I will not make it easy. Before Darren could react, she raised one hand, and the ground beneath them trembled. Crystal walls erupted from the ground, surrounding him in a jagged cage. The air seemed to hum with energy, and Darren felt a strange pressure building in his chest. His eyes darted around, but he couldn't find any way out. The cage had formed too quickly. He had no time to think. He was trapped. Well then, Darren said, trying to steady his nerves. If you want to play mind games, I'm your guy. Xanthia's eyes narrowed as she tilted her head slightly. We will see about that. You're not the first human to come here, but none have passed this trial yet. Darren swallowed, a flicker of unease crossing his mind. This wasn't like the first trial, where logic and reasoning had played a role. This one felt more personal. It was as though Xanthia was reading him, studying his weaknesses, preparing to exploit every fear and uncertainty he had. Why do you want to break me? He asked, hoping his voice didn't betray the growing anxiety he felt. Xanthia smiled, a smile that was both cruel and beautiful. Because, Mr. Hayes, you are not meant to be here. You are not of our world. You are weak, mentally, emotionally, and your kind is not fit to rule. My father chose you out of some misplaced whim, and we will make sure you know your place. Her words hit harder than he anticipated, sending a cold shiver down his spine. Weak, not fit to rule. She was playing on his insecurities, trying to make him doubt himself. The pressure in the air increased, a constant, suffocating force. Darren clenched his fists, forcing himself to stand tall. I'm not weak. Xanthia raised her hand again, and the crystal walls shifted. Suddenly, the air around Darren was filled with images, memories that weren't his own. A dark, rain-soaked alley, his childhood home, the familiar smell of his mother's cooking, a shattered glass of water, his grandfather's body lying cold and still. The visions came fast, one after another, each more terrifying than the last. Faces of people he knew, his friends, his family, twisting into grotesque masks of fear and anger. The walls closed in on him, pressing him into the ground. Do you feel it? Xanthia's voice was a hiss, low and insidious. This is the weight of your failure. This is what awaits you if you cannot rise above your own weakness. Darren's breath came in short, frantic bursts. The memories were too real, too vivid. He could almost feel his chest tighten in panic. He had to fight back, but the darkness of the images was pulling him deeper. But then, something inside him shifted. He remembered the first trial, the questions, the quiet understanding that hope, the mind, and fear were all a part of him, shaped by his past, but not controlling his future. He had survived the first test. He could survive this one too. With a forceful breath, Darren stepped forward, refusing to let the illusions hold him. These are just images, just tricks. His voice shook, but he held his ground. They're not real. The images wavered, flickering like static on a screen. The pressure around him eased as he focused, shutting out the doubts Xanthia had planted. I control my mind. I control my emotions. Not you. Not anyone. He focused on his breathing, his thoughts returning to his purpose. He was here for a reason. His grandfather had made this sacrifice. And now, it was his turn to prove that he could carry on the legacy. He wasn't the weak, fragile human that Xanthia believed him to be. The images dissolved, the dark visions disappearing as if they had never been there. The pressure lifted completely. Xanthia's eyes widened, though she quickly masked it with a smirk. Impressive, she said, though her voice was colder than before. You resisted, but the trial is not over yet. With a snap of her fingers, the crystal walls shifted again, this time forming into a massive, intricate maze that seemed to stretch on forever. The path was winding and treacherous, the walls seemingly endless. You must navigate the maze, she said, stepping back as if her role were already fulfilled. But beware, the challenge is not just physical. It is mental. If you falter, if you show weakness, it will become your undoing. Darren nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. He had no idea what kind of maze he was walking into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Xanthia break him. Not today. Not ever. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, the maze swallowing him whole. His heart pounded, but his resolve was stronger than the fear that tried to creep into his thoughts. He was ready. The trial would not be his downfall. Not when there was so much more at stake. Chapter 4. The Trial of Strength. Darren's feet carried him through the maze, the walls of shifting crystal closing in and opening again with every step. The maze was strange, its walls flickering with patterns of light that danced and swirled, leading him deeper into its labyrinthine heart. At times, it seemed to be moving, rearranging itself, forcing him to retrace steps or take new paths. But every now and then, Darren would catch a glimpse of Xanthia watching from a distance, her expression unreadable. He kept his focus. His mind, sharpened by the images he had just faced, refused to waver. This maze, this trial, wasn't just physical. It was meant to wear him down, to push him until his resolve cracked. But he wouldn't let it. As Darren navigated the maze, a creeping unease began to settle in. The walls seemed to close in tighter as the minutes stretched into hours. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive stillness that gnawed at his concentration. His stomach rumbled. Had he really been in here that long? Tom didn't feel like it had any meaning in this strange place. A sudden crash echoed from ahead, followed by the sound of something or someone crashing through the maze behind him. Darren spun, heart racing. A figure appeared in the distance. It was Xanthia, but not quite like he had seen her before. She was no longer the cold, poised princess, but a primal, raw version of herself. Her hair flew wildly around her face, her eyes a vivid, almost glowing silver. Her posture was aggressive, predatory, as though the walls themselves had unlocked some hidden part of her, a dangerous, untamed force. "Fletcher," she called out, her voice echoing through the maze with unnerving clarity. "This is your final trial." Darren's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the real test of the challenge. "You think you've proven yourself," she sneered, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "But now, you must show strength, not just in your mind, but in your body. Defeat me, and the trial will be over." "Defeat you?" Darren asked, his voice steady despite the tightening knot in his stomach. "You've got to be kidding." Xanthia's lips curled into a wicked smile. "I never joke. Show me you're not the weakling I thought you were. Prove you're worthy of the throne. Show your strength." Before Darren could react, she lunged at him with the speed of a predator. Her movements were like lightning, a blur of fluid grace and power. Darren barely had time to brace himself before she slammed into him, her hands wrapping around his neck in an almost impossible grip. The force of her attack took his breath away, but his instincts kicked in. He grabbed her wrists, trying to break free, but the pressure was immense. His hands burned as he tried to pry her fingers loose. Xanthia laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that reverberated in his ears. "Is this all you've got, Earthling?" she taunted, tightening her grip. "You've barely got the strength to fight back." Darren's vision blurred, the edges of his sight growing dark as the pressure on his throat increased. His pulse hammered in his ears, the weight of her grip beginning to crush him. He couldn't let this be how it ended. He couldn't fail, not after everything. "Think, Darren. You're not just fighting her strength. You're fighting everything she represents. Her pride, her arrogance, her belief that you're nothing." The words from his grandfather echoed in his mind. The greatest strength you can have is the will to keep going. Even when you're down, he dug deep within himself, remembering the lessons he'd learned from his grandfather, remembering the first trial and how he had overcome fear. With a guttural growl, Darren gathered every ounce of strength he had left and twisted his body, slamming his shoulder into Xanthia's side with every ounce of force he could muster. The move caught her off guard. She stumbled back, losing her grip on his throat, and Darren took a sharp, desperate breath. He pushed forward again, his body fueled by raw adrenaline and defiance, grabbing her by the waist and throwing her against one of the crystal walls. She slammed into the wall, the sound of cracking crystal ringing through the maze. Xanthia hissed in pain, but before Darren could make his next move, she was already back on her feet, her eyes blazing with fury. "You are stronger than I thought," she spat, wiping a smear of blood from her lip. "But strength alone won't be enough to win this." Darren didn't wait for her to attack again. He pressed his advantage, his body fueled by the need to prove himself, not just to her, but to the entire galaxy. He wouldn't be a puppet, a weakling. He would show them all that he was worthy of this strange inheritance. With a sudden, powerful shove, Darren knocked Xanthia back once more, forcing her to the ground. The world around him seemed to pause, and for a fleeting moment he saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed by something else, something he hadn't expected: respect. The walls around them shifted again, the crystal surfaces pulsing with energy as Xanthia rose to her feet, her gaze now colder, more calculating than ever. But something had changed. The trial wasn't just about fighting anymore. It had become a test of honor. "You have passed," she said, her voice clipped. "Barely, but I didn't expect you to break. Perhaps you have more of my father's blood in you than I thought." Darren's chest heaved with exhaustion, but he stood tall. This trial isn't over until you admit I'm not the weakling you thought I was. Xanthia studied him for a moment before she nodded slightly. Very well. You've proven your strength. But don't get too comfortable. The next trial will be even more difficult. The ground beneath them trembled again as the maze began to shift, but Darren wasn't worried anymore. He had survived. In the next trial, he was ready. Chapter 5, The Trial of Wisdom. The air in the chamber was thick with anticipation as Darren stood at the entrance, facing the heart of the palace's great hall. The walls shimmered with a soft violet glow, casting strange reflections on the surfaces of the crystalline structures that seemed to breathe with life. The ornate door behind him closed with a silent hiss, sealing him inside. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, past the row of armed guards who stood at attention, their faces impassive. His heart still pounded in his chest from the last trial. Xanthia had been a force of nature, but he'd overcome her, even though she hadn't made it easy. Her respect was grudging, but real. Still, he couldn't allow himself to get comfortable. If the royal family had their way, this would only get harder. As he moved deeper into the hall, the air grew heavier, charged with a sense of history. The walls, inlaid with luminous symbols, seemed to whisper as he passed. He couldn't help but notice the tension in the air, like the very structure of the place was watching him, testing him. The far side of the hall was lined with towering stone pillars. At the center of the room stood a single pedestal, holding what appeared to be a glowing orb. It pulsed with light, giving off a soft hum that echoed through the silent chamber. Step forward, Darren Fletcher, a voice intoned from the shadows, one he knew well, Alenia, the eldest princess. Her figure materialized at the far end of the hall, her radiant presence almost overwhelming. Despite her calm demeanor, Darren could feel the weight of her intelligence, the weight of all the expectations she held for him. Her silver-white eyes gleamed like stars, analyzing him, judging him. "You've survived the trial of strength," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet hall. "Now, you face the trial of wisdom." Darren straightened, meeting her gaze. "I'm ready. What do I need to do?" Alenia's lips curled into a thin smile. "You will need to solve the puzzle of the orb. It will test not just your intelligence, but your ability to see the truth beneath illusion. You must choose wisely, for your choice will determine more than just your fate here. It will decide the fate of your entire species." Darren frowned, confused. "The fate of Earth?" "Indeed. Your people, your planet, are at a crossroads. They've been accepted into the Galactic Council, but the weight of your future rests on your shoulders now. What kind of leader will you be, Darren Fletcher? What kind of man will you become?" The orb in front of him began to glow brighter, its surface shifting as though it were alive, warping and rearranging its form. Symbols danced across it, shifting and changing in a mesmerizing pattern. Alenia's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "There are 3 possible answers to this puzzle," she continued. "Each choice leads down a different path. One path will unite your people and strengthen Earth's position in the galaxy. One path will doom your species to irrelevance. The third will tear your planet apart." Darren stepped forward cautiously, staring at the orb. His mind raced. The pressure of it all was suffocating. The weight of not just his own life, but the future of humanity, rested in this moment. But how could he possibly know which choice was the right one? As the orb pulsed before him, strange images flashed within it. Visions of Earth, of cities burning, of alliances forged, of planets in ruins. The possibilities were endless, but none of them made sense. His heart beat faster, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He looked to Alenia, but she didn't offer any guidance. She simply watched, waiting. "I have to choose," Darren thought. "The future of Earth depends on this." The orb continued to shift, its surface now covered in strange, cryptic symbols, each one flashing rapidly. Darren's mind raced. His instincts told him to choose carefully, to think beyond what was visible. He remembered something his grandfather had once told him. True wisdom is not just about knowledge. It's about understanding what's hidden beneath the surface. You must look past the obvious. He took a deep breath and focused, ignoring the chaos in his mind. He reached out toward the orb, his fingers hovering just above its glowing surface. Alenia's voice broke through his thoughts. Remember, Darren, the wrong choice could mean the destruction of your world. Destruction or salvation, he thought. The weight of the galaxy itself rests on me. With a steady hand, he pressed his fingers to the orb, feeling it pulse under his touch. Immediately, the symbols shifted, and a sharp, brilliant light flooded the room. Darren squinted, shielding his eyes from the intensity. Suddenly, the light faded, and the orb settled into a soft, constant glow. Alenia's voice was quiet, almost surprised. You've chosen the path of unity. Darren stepped back, his heart pounding. Unity? Is that good? The princess nodded slowly. Yes, it's the hardest path, the one that requires the most sacrifice. But it is the path that will ensure Earth's survival and its place among the stars. The other paths would have destroyed your planet. They would have set your people against each other, leading to your downfall. Darren felt a wave of relief wash over him, mixed with exhaustion. He had done it. He had chosen the right path. But as he looked at Alenia, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the trials still to come. Does this mean I've passed? He asked, his voice hoarse. Alenia's eyes softened, though the regal coldness never fully left her. Yes, you've proven you are capable, but there is still much to be done. The final trial awaits. Darren nodded, feeling a shiver run down his spine. What is it? Alenia didn't respond at first. Instead, she turned toward the far end of the hall, where another set of doors had appeared. The final trial is not one of strength or intellect. It is a trial of heart, and it will determine whether or not you are truly worthy of your role in the kingdom. Darren's mind raced as he followed her toward the doors. A trial of heart? What could that possibly mean? The doors opened with a soft hum, revealing a vast, starry expanse stretching out before him. He stepped forward, uncertainty still gripping his heart. And there, at the center of it all, stood his destiny.